Europeans have always been afraid of malaria. And the fear comes from their very first contact with malaria. Malaria killed hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Europeans who first came to Africa. That's why West Africa earned the epithet, the white man's grave. So that fear that malaria is a killer disease is present in European consciousness. The idea that I'm going to talk about now is the malaria.
Okay.
It's the main chapter in the book. The title of the book is taken from one of the chapters.
Okay.
Which is Who's Afraid of Malaria. The theories concerning the control of malaria emanated from the schools of hygiene and tropical medicine in Europe. Two of them in the United Kingdom, one in London, one in Liverpool. And each European capital has a school of hygiene and tropical medicine. And the theory is, to protect Europeans who are living in Africa, you must do two things. First, you must find a drug that kills the parasite in the person who suffers malaria. And secondly, to prevent malaria, you must separate the person from the source of malaria. You must try and separate him as much as possible from the mosquito that carries the parasite, the Anopheles mosquito. That is why you find that historically the European quarters were carefully designed to be on elevated ground, hill station in Sierra Leone, hill station in Jos, high ground in Ibadan, and so on and so forth. The idea was for Europeans to live as far away as possible from the native population and to live at height that prevented Anopheles mosquito from reaching them. So that fear is there, and that's what has caused the strategy that I was talking about. First of all, you have to cure the disease by killing the parasite. Secondly, you must find a way to protect the individual from contact with the malaria. The point I'm trying to make is that these strategies have not worked because both the mosquito and the malaria parasite are ancient organisms that have lived through millennia, thousands of years of adapting to different conditions of life.
How does that link now back to the approach of research? I mean, you mentioned that the Europeans are driving the direction of the research and the approach.
Yes.
If the Africans were driving it, what would be different, or what's the message there?
Well, my suggestion is that the research so far, as I've described it, is centered on two things. First of all, it is centered on the parasite which causes the disease. And the approach is to find a drug that kills the parasite. And it's also centered on an individual who is to be protected from contact with the parasite. And I think these two approaches are Eurocentric. So we need to have an Afrocentric. We need to focus research that makes the African person the center of the strategy. And this is what I mean. If you look at the history of malaria, you'll find that malaria did not wipe Africans out. 500 years ago, when the Europeans first came to Africa, the place was full of human beings. We don't know how many people there were, but clearly there was no lack of humanity. Otherwise, the slave trade would not have started. They saw human bodies. All we can say is that African people have lived with this parasite for millennia. That's the first thing to take notice of. Secondly, we can ask the question, how is it that they survived? There must be something in the African biochemistry or physiology or whatever it is that gives them the ability to survive the malaria parasite. And two, they must have suffered from malaria, even though they didn't know it as malaria. They must have suffered from malaria. If they suffer from malaria, how did they treat it? What did they do about it? If we can find out these two things, the biochemistry of the African that enabled him to resist malaria, and two, what kind of treatment did the traditional Africa offer against malaria, we will be arming ourselves with some equipment with which to fight malaria today.
But when people always say that Africans are dying like flies from malaria, and if not for all these modern treatments, the mortality rate would have been higher. So it means maybe they were having more children, and just accounting for the fact that 20% might die from malaria.
Maybe. But my experience is that if you go and ask Africans, even today, even in urban areas or rural areas, ask Africans, what do you think of the World Health Organization statistic that 1 million children die from malaria every year, mostly in Africa? And when we say mostly in Africa, we actually mean it mostly in Nigeria. What do you think? Most people just say, well, that's WHO. I mean, they are ignorant. That attitude is ignorance. But it is it reflects the fact that this fear which WHO has, it's not the fear that Nigerians have. It's not the fear that Africans have about malaria. Because they look around them. I was just telling you that my niece had 13 children growing up in the village. Something must have protected them because there was no mosquito net, there was no chemotherapy, they all survived. Some of them are lawyers, some of them are accountants. And other people will tell you experiences of this kind. So the fear is the fear of other people about malaria. That brings me to the point that I'm going to discuss later on in this lecture. That when I say who is afraid of malaria, I'm not saying that WHO is afraid of malaria. I'm saying that where does the fear reside? Does it reside in the Africans or in the non-immune Caucasian who hopes to come to Africa one day and doesn't want to be killed by this terrible disease? He wants to find a cure so that he can easily come to Africa and do business and not worry. The parasite especially that we're trying to kill, that causes the disease, the Plasmodium falciparum, has elaborate mechanisms for overcoming drugs or chemicals that you are meant to kill it. And therefore, in fact, the experience to date is that any drug that tries to kill this organism, the organism has the capability to develop resistance to it. So at one time, quinine was very effective in treating malaria. In fact, the old colonial government survived basically on the basis of quinine because they used to put a lot of quinine in the gin that they drank, which was their pleasure, their pastime.